Juni's call for papers suggested that the philosophy of history does not have much of a role in current academia, having lost it since the heyday of the analytical philosophy of history. Perhaps now, goes on, could be the time to regain that position. Those are the days. First, I'll say something about when that heyday was, who had it, what made it a heyday. We know that it wasn't the heyday of so-called speculative philosophy of history, and you know what that means. Later writers in that area just looked old-fashioned. The whole idea had been squashed by Karl Popper and Isaiah Berlin, as far as analytical philosophers were concerned. Patrick Gardiner had been able to write an introductory book in the area without referring to the speculative philosophy of history at all. That was in 1952, although Walsh, who published his introduction 1 year earlier, had felt it necessary to apologize in case it was thought to be speculative. But non-analytical philosophers of history, and those reflecting on historical method, had a bit of a heyday too, without being speculative, and again, not being analytical. So you'll be familiar perhaps with American discussions, for example, Becker and Beard. You'll be aware of the kinds of things that E.H. Carr was picking up on. You'll be aware of, in the UK, the Bury-Trevelyan debate, for example. There's Bury asserting that history was a science in 1902, and Trevelyan denying it in 1903. A lot of people took their cue from Hegel in philosophy. So Bradley had written the presuppositions of critical history in 1874. Michael Oakeshott had written on historical causation in 1933. And Collingwood's 1936 lectures, published in 1946 as the idea of history, of course, are very influential too. But none of those did very much to influence the analytical philosophy of history. William Drey's authoritative collection of 1966, Philosophical Analysis and History, did not include anything by Collingwood, despite the obvious debt to him in that Laws and Explanation in History book of 1957, in which he said how much he owed to Walsh, his teacher, and Walsh, in his work, made explicit how much he owed to Collingwood. Analytical philosophy of history, obviously enough, was part of analytical philosophy. And of course, that approach, as a philosophical approach more generally, continues. But the call for papers plausibly sees the heyday as ending when our interests transitioned towards studying the narrative aspects of history, writing in the 70s and 80s. And that is a fair assessment, because most of us are likely to think that the proper study of the narrative aspects of history began with Hayden White's Meta-History in 1973, which is plausibly not a contribution to the analytical philosophy of history. There was a bit of spat about who did it first, but it wasn't David Hume himself. Then either Carl Hempel or Karl Popper or Ernest Nagel introduced into more general analytical philosophical discussion from the empiricist tradition in the philosophy of science, a theory of causal explanation. The heyday of analytical philosophy of history began with the stimulation provided not by Hume, Popper, or Nagel, but by Hempel's 1942 The Function of General Laws in History, a classic, as Patrick Gardiner observed. So Hempel applied that philosophy of science style theory of causation explicitly to historical explanation. It looked to be just another confident application of the very fruitful, successful, and influential analytical philosophical research program in mainstream pre-Kuhn, Hume-based empiricist philosophy of science. As such, it might have been comparatively unimportant, because it was simply an application of an existing successful philosophy, from the point of view of analytical philosophers, to history, which was, for analytical philosophers, an extramural discipline in which few of them were interested. And indeed, that lack of interest in history has lasted most of my lifetime. Even the history of analytical philosophy itself, to which what I'm now saying is a tiny contribution, has only in the last 5 years warranted its own academic journal. They weren't interested in history. Most of them still aren't. But the heyday for the analytical philosophy of history initially developed with responses to Hempel from the wider intellectual world of social theorists, because his article provided a focal point for those wondering about the possibility of a genuinely scientific social science. That issue, reinvigorating the traditional question of how far history was itself a science, began to attract the attention of a few analytical philosophers. The heyday arguably reached its highest point when William Drey responded to Hempel in 1957 with that book, Laws and Explanation in History. And that Hempel-Drey philosophical debate stimulated many analytical contributions. Once Hempel's assertions about causal explanation in history had gained that wider traction, analytical reflection about the usual mainstream philosophical issues for once required that attention be given not to history itself, if you can make sense of that, but to historians' modes of thought. For example, to historical method, or to how historians behaved, or to how they wrote. So analytical philosophy of history thus had its heyday in virtue of being valued not by historians who took virtually no notice until philosophers started saying things about narrative, but by those analytical philosophers who had not taken seriously previously the explanation of human action by historians. How historians actually explained then, for a short period, took center stage for those analytical philosophers with an interest in understanding humanity, not least because historical explanations seemed to provide some kind of factual test for the universal application of their empiricist philosophical approaches. There was, at least in principle, for those who were interested, a role for historians in these philosophical debates, and a very small number of historians contributed. The journal History and Theory was founded in that climate in 1960, 3 years after Drey's book. Causes versus reasons in the explanation of human action was an ancient philosophical debate that was advanced by that discussion and continues today. But as the debate progressed, it crystallized into what we analytical philosophers now call the philosophy of action. And over the years, it left behind any new input from historians or from historical examples. Once the main points of the Hempel-Drey debate had been absorbed, later analytical philosophy of the causation of human action made no further significant reference to historians' explanations. As the analytical philosophers came to think, it was not as if historians explained human actions particularly well, although they were using partisan notions of what counted as explaining human actions particularly well. When philosophical outsiders were admitted to later discussions of the philosophy of action, they were from psychology, or economic theory, or anthropology, or robotics, but not from history. By the 1960s, those few remaining analytical philosophers still interested in historical understanding had also moved on to the analysis of narratives. That was mainly a continuation of their interest in causation. There were three main works in the 1960s addressing the issue of how analytically you make sense of narratives. Galli's Philosophy and the Historical Understanding of 1964, Danto's Analytical Philosophy of History of 1965, and Morton White's Foundations of Historical Knowledge in the same year. Each of these made important contributions to the theory of history. Galli described the need for a historical story to be followable and introduced the notion of essentially contested concepts. Danto introduced the notion of narrative sentences, and with that made a contribution to making sense of temporal language. And Morton White described and analyzed historical discourse in terms of fact, law, and value, and used Hempel and the then current standard philosophy of science more explicitly than the others. Between them, they said much more that was of interest to other theorists of history, but from the point of view of what was of interest to mainstream analytical philosophy, all three of them were contributing in some small way to the analytical discussion of the nature of causation, a continuing and central analytical issue as the advance of 20th century physics forced a reconsideration of some fundamental concepts of science, in particular space, time, and causation. Galli, who had followed closely the debates in the philosophy of science, argued for an interpretation of historical causation in terms of necessary conditions, rather than in terms of the standard model used by Hempel, which is briefly sufficient conditions. That was, however, accepted by Danto and Morton White, standard model. But neither Danto nor White had been mainstream contributors to the philosophy of science. And rather than producers of the standard model used by Hempel, they were consumers of it. They took for granted Hempel's philosophy of causal explanation and tried to develop it as a way of structuring narrative explanation in history. Very few analytical philosophers, centered on the sciences as they mostly were, thought that it was worth pursuing Galli's view that causes might be necessary conditions, and they quickly gave up the suggestion as the debates about causation became flooded with more complex arguments relating time, space, logic, and probability. If historians actually explained in terms of necessary conditions, and they didn't really care if they did, that in itself was of very little philosophical interest, and it merely shows that historians were missing out most of the subtleties that physics or even the developing social sciences embraced. Again, very few analytical philosophers, centered on the sciences as they mostly were, thought that any continuing philosophical interest arose from the detail of how causal explanation might structure historical understanding presented in narrative form. Causal explanation was best understood through the science, and the philosophy of science was developing well in regard to that. That the analytical philosophy of causation might be shown to be applicable to historical narrative understanding was to be expected. How exactly it was to be done was a minor interest. The philosophical analysis of the explanation of human action, as I've said, was in due course developed in other contexts than history. So that interest on the part of analytical philosophers in history was ebbing. And by the late 1960s, they've almost all moved on. After their works on narrative, Galli moved to political science. Danto concentrated on art and aesthetics. Morton White moved on in intellectual history. And that, indeed, ended the heyday of the analytical philosophy of history. Interestingly, significant objections to the heyday of philosophy of science itself were already looming after Thomas Kuhn's work, particularly his Structure of Scientific Revolutions in 1962. Yet discussion of Kuhn's problematic relations between the analytical philosophy of science, which Hempel was using, and the history of science, involved very little connection with any remaining discussion in the analytical philosophy of history. There was a paper on that in the very first issue of History and Theory, but it had virtually no connection with the then existing arguments in the analytical philosophy of history. There was, for many decades, and continues to be, a small rump of philosophers who have a special interest in, for example, Hegel or Gentile or Collingwood, and on the whole, analytical philosophers have ignored them, much as they regarded the history of their own subject as a different kind of activity from their own subject itself. For their part, historians have mostly ignored philosophers of any stripe. As I've said, they've long made and continue to make their own contributions to theorizing about history. Richard J. Evans remarked, some historians have even disputed the right of non-historians to write about the nature of historical knowledge at all. Those few historians who gave Hempel any attention mostly thought that analytical philosophy was not to be taken seriously as any kind of player in mainstream historical debates. And Bill Dray, who had begun his academic life studying history, had, as a philosopher in later life, done little more than refine Collingwood's position on empathetic understanding, a position most historians were happy to live with if they thought about it at all. Unlike Dre, they took little interest in Hempel's theory of causation. But when Morton White and Arthur Danto extended what Dre had called covering law theory as a way of analysing historical narratives, for a short period around those works' publication in 1965, some historians found the approach less easy to ignore. White's and Danto's science-sourced causal structures were in general not accepted by historians or by non-analytical theorists of history, and historians' responses were, in the main, loud and, to begin with, simple. Jack Hexter, probably the loudest and most effective of historian objectors in the hearing of analytical philosophers, spoke for many historians in characterizing the Hempelian solution to the nature of historical understanding as one which mistakenly assimilated history to science. Hexter saw the analytical philosopher's model as being imposed on history, so that Hempel, White, and Danto should be seen as making a prescriptive power grab where the foundations of knowledge were concerned. The philosophers imposing the model, White and Danto particularly, had unpleasant traits of character. Reviewing Morton White's Foundations of Historical Knowledge, Hexter ascribed to White an intellectual imperialism generated by the sin of intellectual pride. White, he said, was peremptory, preemptive, and prescriptive about meaning, knowing, understanding, explanation, and truth. This objection looked for a moment like simple name-calling, and philosophers had long taught each other not to engage in arguments ad hominem. However, what I've quoted is only half of Hexter's point, which was, in its way, more philosophical. In effect, he attacked the status of Hempel-based so-called models of historical explanation by posing a philosophical dilemma. These models from analytical philosophy were either prescriptive or descriptive. If prescriptive, then they were indeed a power grab by a disciplinary rival that failed to take history seriously as a knowledge-producing discipline. Well aware that the fact-value distinction, to which Humean empiricist philosophers such as Hempel in 1942 were committed, applied as much to philosophy itself as to anything else, Hexter knew very well that prescriptive, otherwise normative claims, all matters of valuation, were not seen as ultimately rationally supportable within that empiricist philosophy, and ultimately depended on taste and temper. So such empiricist philosophers of science had no business setting standards for what ought to be done in history, and were contradicting their own position in attempting it. On the other hand, Hexter's argument continued, if an empiricist model of explanation such as Hempel's was descriptive of history rather than prescriptive for it, then it was flatly false. Historians knew better than philosophers did what was going on in history. History was a major epistemic discipline that involved successful methodological practices in which they were experts. It was clear to all that analytical philosophers' reading of historical works was at best cursory, and their experience of historical practice largely non-existent. When it came to describing what historians did, historians used evidence grounded in their experience, while the philosophers, Hempel for example, were offering abstract intellectual speculative constructs that failed to fit the facts of the epistemic practices of historians. Arthur Danto complained about this review by Jack Hexter of his and White's books, describing it as vagrant and irrelevant. I quote, "What Hexter evidently wants is some sort of exact composite portrait of the working historian." Responding to Hexter in the New York Review of Books, Danto knew he would have historian readers, and presumably thought that this supposedly authoritative rhetorical riposte would be effective for them. It wasn't. Danto possibly thought that few analytical philosophical readers read the New York Review of Books. For if they read outside philosophy, they surely read science rather than literature. But in any event, he didn't provide any suitable summary argument in objection to the review, merely taking it for granted that any analytical philosophers would understand what was so obviously wrong with Hexter's demand. But whatever was wrong with it, if anything, it wasn't obvious. Analytical philosophers generally were aware of objections like Hexter's, even though they didn't get the problem from him, because it arose in relation to their work in analytical philosophy of science, were their models prescriptive or descriptive. Some of those philosophers brazenly accepted one choice posed by the dilemma and thought that, power grab or not, philosophers did indeed know better than historians what counted as knowledge. They imposed on history models derived from science just because science rather than history really was an epistemically licit discipline for reasons that they thought obvious. Others accepted the other horn of Hexter's dilemma. As late as 1976, Jon Goldstein affirmed as an assumption for his own philosophy of history in the book Historical Knowing that, quote, history is an epistemically licit discipline which deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms, which meant that philosophers should not impose on historians alien criteria of knowledge. But agreeing that history was epistemically licit, or being otherwise history-friendly, left wholly unclear what kind of description rather than prescription Goldstein and other philosophers similarly placed were themselves engaged in. Should analytical philosophers provide an exact portrait? Should they be writing the history of historiography? Very few thought that. Nevertheless, they felt that in some way they had to do better. But although they merely described or redescribed perhaps, the rational structure of historical methods, whatever they thought doing, the philosophical nature of that was not wholly clear to them. But then it wasn't clear what was going on in philosophy of science either. What had driven the problem was the nature of philosophy itself and the common characterization of it as finding fundamental and so universal or exhaustive categorizations or truths which, being universal or exhaustive, necessarily applied to philosophy itself. Just as medieval theology had held the immanence-transcendence distinction to be categorically foundational and exhaustive, and just as Descartes had held the mind-body distinction to be categorically foundational and exhaustive, and just as Kant had held the a priori-a posteriori distinction to be categorically foundational and exhaustive, so the Humean empiricism that underlay the so-called standard analytical philosophy of science, expressed by Hempel and used by White and Danto, carried on that ancient tradition and involved its own supposedly fundamental categorizations: fact versus value, analytic versus synthetic, prescriptive versus descriptive, for example. Such distinctions were and are problematic. It is easy to invent categorical and exhaustive distinctions because, given elementary laws of logic, one can sort the world in terms of either asserting or denying any arbitrarily selected assertion whatsoever. Either that assertion or its denial are bound to be true, which makes the distinction in question empty in its application. To make any such distinctions work, one needs to provide separate, contentful criteria for each side of the distinction, and then at least semi-metaphysical, not just logical, grounds that support the claims to the absoluteness of the distinction and the exhaustiveness of its application. On the whole, such grounds have not been found. Maybe the elementary laws of logic are themselves at risk. Analytical philosophers had long worried about their own methods, and the journal Metaphilosophy was founded by 1970. Categorical distinctions could not be taken for granted at a meta-theoretical level. So Hexter's descriptive-prescriptive dilemma, while it was a proper one to pose in objection to philosophers like White and Danto committed to that very distinction, was ad hominem in its effect, not in general sound. Analytical philosophy was itself supposed to be in some ways scientific, but what counted as scientific would be the upshot of philosophy of science, and the way to construe that would depend on the development of that subject. And falsification by facts was not involved except superficially. By 1962, Kuhn had begun to revolutionize philosophy of science by historicizing it, using a broadly pragmatic rather than simple empiricist approach. Hempel's presupposition that philosophers of history being scientific about history required that their models be falsifiable. Hexter's presupposition that if you're to be scientific as a philosopher in your description about history, that model that you provide has to be falsifiable by the facts of historical practice, involved an understanding of the philosophy of science and its application in metaphilosophy that was already being overturned. So after Kuhn's 1962 publication, and apart from Goldstein, a dilemma like Hexter's found no traction among analytical philosophers of science, and hence no traction among analytical philosophers of history either. While there were, in the context of analysing narratives, significant differences between them, mainly between Danto and Morton White on one hand and Galli on the other, all three of them, as philosophers of narrative, were nevertheless, in some central sense, like Kuhn, philosophical pragmatists. Unlike Kuhn, and by 1965 somewhat out of touch with the latest developments in philosophy of science, Danto, White and Galli thought that probably committed them to the epistemic priority of science. Nevertheless, they were well informed in the American tradition of pragmatism, particularly its then outcome in Quine's work, which dated in relevant aspects from 1951. Quine had argued by then for the continuity between science and philosophy without any principled distinction between those subjects. It was no doubt their pragmatism that led Danto and White to an interest in history anyway. Pragmatism's interest in history had gone back to Peirce, on whom Galli wrote a book. Like Quine, they did not distinguish analytical from pragmatic philosophical approaches, as some others wished to do, and they saw, as I do, their pragmatism as being part of the analytical tradition, but no longer of the empiricist kind. Those analytical philosophers who did read Hexter's review of Danto and White would have seen it as intemperate. And I know from my own observation of historians what masters of invective they can be. Hexter was expert at that. Analytical philosophers, while familiarly bullying each other in seminars, nevertheless saw and continue to see themselves as operating according to standards of logic rather than rhetoric, and as going wherever the arguments led. Hexter's describing Morton White as assuming an intellectual imperialism generated by the sin of intellectual pride was a clearly illegitimate comment from the point of view of analytical philosophy. It addressed the person and not the issue. But take Hexter's point seriously as a historical assertion about Morton White's character or thought processes. Is it true that White was a proud intellectual imperialist? It's appropriate to use empathy to assess this, being a method widely viewed by historians, not least Hexter himself, as at least one acceptable and characteristic historiographical way of making sense of individual actions. And it's plausible to believe that the analytical philosophy of history would do well to revisit the analysis of empathy. We can leave aside for a moment whether making sense of White's thinking by empathizing with it can be properly modeled by covering law theory. We would then attempt to empathize, at least in summary, with White's intellectual attitudes at the time he was writing that book that Hexter reviewed. Empathizing with individuals involves ascribing thoughts and attitudes to them, familiarly by doing our best to put ourselves in their position and attempting, at least in a metaphorical sense, to see things from their point of view. When we do this, we are imagining being in their situation. But we are imagining what we hold to be real and not merely imaginary. Although we must allow that it takes evidence to support a claim that our empathizing is successful rather than merely the construction of something fictional. Insofar as we succeed in empathizing with others, we are sharing with those others a world of thoughts or ideas, but we do not need to share with those others any particular philosophical position about the status of those ideas. Nevertheless, so central is the need for empathy in the shared construction of the world we share with others, that the centrality of ideas may well drive the sense that some idealist philosophy is required. There are various characteristics to be picked out from within their point of view, so understood. We are trying to get into their world as they are aware of it, but also into their world as they are unaware of it. Collingwood famously analysed this historiographical method as the reenactment of past thought, and it's common to understand him as referring to another individual's conscious thought. But as I've argued elsewhere, it's plausible to hold that that interpretation would make impossible the recovery of another of Collingwood's notions, absolute presuppositions, just because they are understood as assumptions which are so firmly taken for granted that they are not a part of the past individual's conscious deliberation. In the history of philosophy, we often have to recover unconscious assumptions by the analysis of explicit thoughts, an analysis that might rely on predicate logic, compositional implicatures, or other time-extended notions of dialogue or argumentation. It may be that few of us recognize ourselves well, as the Scots poet Robert Burns remarked, would some power the gift to give us to see ourselves as others see us. Morton White's conscious thought surely did not include some explicit recognition on his part that his intellectual attitudes were proudly imperialist. But of course they may have been proudly imperialist anyway, consciously unexamined as we might take them to have been. Yet any historian would need some evidence for that, and it's difficult to see what logical analysis of his writings could yield that result. But there is evidence against that ascription to him as a feature of White's character, namely that White shared his attitudes with other analytical philosophers. As I remarked earlier, he was himself, like Danto, a consumer of covering law theory, not a producer of it, intent on applying this idea in the apparently alien intellectual land of history. And indeed, that does look imperialist. But neither White nor Danto questioned the empiricist foundations of covering law theory with its commitment to certain positions on knowledge and truth. Pragmatically, these were for them the best answer. I say for them because pragmatism is wary of universalizing. Those foundations of empiricism and the like and philosophy of science operated for them just as Collingwood described in introducing his idea of an absolute presupposition. The empiricist assumptions were, for White and Danto, psychological rather than Cartesian certainties. Unexamined presuppositions underlying the beliefs and attitudes involved in their ordinary analytical philosophical ways of life, contingently uncriticized and uncriticizable by them at the time. While they probably gave the matter no conscious attention whatever, a Kuhnian revolution in their analytical philosophy was not, in their view, required by their pragmatism, and as pragmatists they were engaged in what Kuhn would have called normal rather than revolutionary analytical philosophy. So the empiricist foundations of covering law theory were uncriticized and uncriticizable by White and Danto at the time because they were not entertained as conscious thoughts for examination. They were at no point doubted, and neither White nor Danto perceived any alternatives to them with which they might be actively contrasted. Problems not frameable in the empiricist terms familiar to them were not recognized. Hexter complained that it was explicit in White's approach that he didn't allow the elements of historical writing outside the causal skeleton of explanatory and descriptive statements to be expressive of knowledge of the historical past. White responded that he'd made plain the literary or evaluative elements in historical writing. But it was not that claim that offended Hexter, but rather the implication that such elements had nothing to do with knowledge, the implication that any feature of historical writing outside the scientific skeleton had no explanatory or truth-telling use. Hexter did, we might now think, given our familiarity with Hayden White's position, offer White and Danto what we might now judge to have been a serious alternative to their approach. He, Hexter, thought that certain literary elements, which he called the rhetoric of history, were themselves an essential way of expressing historical knowledge. The rhetorical side of historical writing, you might think of as the ordering or emplotment of sentences in a narrative, has an explanatory of truth-telling use, and that certainly sounds like Hayden White. But Hayden White's metahistory in 1973 fared no better than Hexter in 1967. Neither White nor Danto, nor analytical philosophers generally, recognized any possible alternative here. They ignored later theories of narrative, with their frequent uses of or references to literary approaches. The analytical philosophers found these literary approaches, with their implicit denial of compositionality, unacceptable, holding, as those analytical philosophers characteristically did, to atomistic, empiricist, and Fregean theories of meaning, reference, and truth. Only a fancy view of historical truth, Morton White claimed in due course without argument, would permit such an approach. Yet this was not imperialist stonewalling, but simple blindness born of normal philosophy, well described by Kuhn, albeit in different contexts. I've argued elsewhere that the main characteristic of narratives, which I prefer to call accounts as a whole, because there are various ways of structuring them, is their time-extended nature, both in the time it takes to read, write, or understand them, and the temporal extension of the period covered and to which they give meaning. Such accounts, I've said, are to be understood as shareable with others in a shared historical consciousness in both reading and writing. To be shared, communicable thought, and therefore language, is essential. Much analysis is still required of meaning, reference, and truth at that holistic level. As I've suggested, there are features that may well require to be grasped on idealist assumptions, but as a whole, each account sorts the shared world it describes in an analogous manner to that in which atomistically understood concepts may be, in a neo-Kantian way, thought of as sorting the world in their less or none temporally extended ways. Pragmatic choices of reference and description are in principle available to us. Again, as I've argued elsewhere on pragmatic grounds, it's often the case that modes of reference and description are established and there is no practical room for revising them. Nevertheless, there are continued opportunities for choice in many situations, particularly when it comes to sorting our understanding of the world and making our future. The theoretical principle that we can choose how to sort the world needs to be understood as directing theoretical attention to the myriad contingencies of when choices are available, what those choices are, and who the we might be that has a realistic opportunity to choose in such context, and the power and ability to carry through any decision. In effect, the power and ability to create a future, whether that involves an advance in theorizing or a political program. There is no essence of history. There are a number of ways of giving meaning to time-extended experience. The role of narrative theories in any meaningful structure is contingent. We do not face a binary choice between Frege and narrative theory. It's appropriate here to present examples of different ways in which the meaning of a time-extended experience can be given by quoting from the classical Latin author Plutarch. They sent a dispatch scroll to Lysander to recall him. These scrolls are made up in the following way. When the ephors send out a general or admiral, they prepare 2 cylindrical pieces of wood of exactly the same length and thickness, each corresponding to the other in its dimensions. One of these they keep themselves, the other being given to the departing officer. Whenever they want to send some important message secretly, they make a long, narrow strip of parchment like a leather strap and wind it round the cylinder with the edges touching so there is no space between the folds. Having done this, they write their message on the parchment in the position in which it was wrapped around the cylinder, and then they unwind the parchment and send it without the cylinder to the commander. When it reaches him, he has no means of deciphering it, as the letters have no connection and appear to be all broken up. And he has to take his own cylinder and wind the strip of parchment round it. The spiral is then arranged in the correct sequence, the letters fall into their proper order, and he can read round the cylinder and understand the message as a continuous whole. The parchment, I'll leave out that bit. Notice that it's an accident of language, a mere contingency of symbolic presentation, whether the, quote, letters that have no connection when not in spiral form are rather whole words or even whole sentences. The message has to be understood as a continuous whole regardless. Logically, the whole in that particular example has not a narrative form, but the pragmatic status of a command. A second example from Plutarch. The king of Persia gave Themistocles leave to speak with complete frankness about the affairs of Greece. Themistocles replied that human speech may be compared to an embroidered tapestry, which shows its various patterns when it's spread out, but conceals and distorts them when it's rolled up. And for this reason, he needed time. The king was pleased with this simile and told him to take as much time as he chose. Themistocles asked for a year. In that time, he mastered the Persian tongue sufficiently well to converse with the king without an interpreter. But even a carpet entirely in the Persian tongue still needs to be unrolled, of course. Classically trained as they undoubtedly were, Morton White and Dante were nevertheless not open to conceptions of meaning like this, beyond the atomistic approach of their version of empiricism. That version was an absolute presupposition for them. Absolute presuppositions are recognizable with historical hindsight when it might be found that alternatives have been in principle available, but which were not in fact noticed or practically noticeable at the time. Only later philosophers, perhaps even White and Dante themselves, might be able to bring to mind these in an examinable manner, because, with hindsight, they could perhaps then recognize that there were alternatives to them that marked the limitations of the presuppositions they had once unthinkingly had. More likely, however, they would have tried to avoid what C.E.M. Joad called the acute mental discomfort involved in the required rearrangement of mental furniture. This last, Joad continued, is a task from which we increasingly shrink as we grow older and after middle age are usually unable to perform at all. And that might be a view taken up what I'm saying. However, Hexter's response did not amount to presenting a recognizable alternative. For White and Dante, looking forward along what they thought of as the path of further analytical philosophical development, there was no way forward in the future without the empiricist and Fregean assumptions they were taking for granted. There was no self-doubt. There was no ground for examining the presuppositions. It's not that they were imperialistic. They were responsible, middle of the road in their unexamined acceptance of what was for them well-established theory. By contrast, Hexter's denial of their attitude was intellectually irresponsible, indeed revolutionary from their point of view. Normal philosophy, as they understood it, would collapse if Hexter was right. And if Dante and White thought in such terms, completely understandable in terms of proper historiographical empathizing with them. When we empathize with some past individual, as we are imagining now, we should recognize that this is in principle no different from empathizing with somebody in our present world. Can we really get into the mind of another? It's a familiar problem in philosophy derived from Descartes' position, whether you can do this. You can't even be sure that another person's got a mind at all. It's a philosophical advance on Descartes. In the world of analytical philosophy, that advance is most explicitly derived from Wittgenstein, to recognize that much, if not all, of mind and the correct application of mental predicates lies in the public realm. We share much with other people. We are, in fact, able to understand them, often to the point of being able to ascribe a range of beliefs and past experiences to them, and also to trust them to act appropriately in a wide range of circumstances. We also know that some people are untrustworthy or have mental problems we are not familiar with, or experiences we have never had, or speak in languages difficult to interpret, or are secretive and unwilling to share. When I moved from Edinburgh University to Cambridge to work with Bryce Galley, I was warned by one of my tutors, George Davey, the expert on the Scottish Enlightenment, that in his experience of Galley, I would not be able to find out what he thought philosophically by talking to him, but would have to read his works. And that turned out to be, and it still is, true. And it makes no difference to my understanding of him that Galley is now long dead. Facial cues, turns of phrase, are indeed no longer available. He's not able to confirm or disconfirm any attempt to grasp his thinking, but he wouldn't have done that anyway. So such face-to-face evidence wouldn't have been of much help if he were here now. And such as these are familiar practical hurdles that we all have to jump in understanding other people. We need not import the alleged Cartesian impossibility of entering another's mind as a ground for making impossible empathizing with a past individual, as if it were an additional ground for skepticism with respect to knowledge of the past. There's no difference in principle from empathizing with a present individual, merely the absence of some cues he might otherwise have. On the other hand, in such practical terms, once a person is dead, we often have evidence about what they thought, which was not available to us when they were alive. I do not need, in my use of empathy, in what I am saying, to carry some extra burden of proof with regard to understanding others in the past, beyond what is required in the present. In summary, if you can empathize with me, then I can empathize with Norton White. We're imagining in both cases. Imagining empathizing with a more general case, I imagine that I, like them, am trying to give some meaning to the imagined space and time they are in, some meaning to the world that they are conscious of being in, some meaning to the time-extended experience they are living through. Meaning here is not some merely metaphorical expression. Rather, that whole of spatially and temporally local experience which empathy gives us expresses the world so experienced in a full-blooded way, so that I can draw on a non-Fregean conception of empirical meaning and hold that whole to be what Quine called a unit of empirical significance. Helpfully, Quine's view in Two Dogmas was that the term and the individual statement are not units of empirical significance, and that the whole of science is. But we shouldn't accept his view that these are incompatible alternatives. Taking pragmatism seriously, more seriously than Quine did, I hold it to be a pragmatic or contingent matter what we count a unit of empirical significance to be, depending upon the different purposes we may have. So I can certainly allow that Quine's whole of science can be a unit of empirical significance, but I also hold that a term can be, and an individual sentence can be, but centrally for historical understanding, that whole time-extended world with which we empathize, and that whole time-extended world expressed in a typical historical account, can also be a unit of empirical significance. So we do, in many cases, need some of the atomistic empiricist elements. Pragmatism enables us to keep them. As Fregean said, it must be laid down that a letter retains in a given context the meaning once given to it. And it's characteristic of language that it be reliable in shared contexts. But this doesn't require that symbolic units be universally applicable in the sense of having eternal, re-identifiable meanings regardless of context. We do not need to think of our temporally extended worlds as quasi-mathematical and requiring to be sorted in terms of fixed meanings, although there are areas of discourse where that is indeed our aim. In the small areas of life, operating with moderate-sized specimens of dry goods, to use J.L. Austin's words, it's helpful in all manner of ways to have established meanings. For example, it seems to us that objects persist through time, and persistence of word meaning can reflect that. Establishing each word or symbol or other signifier to mean the same is similar to making in monetary systems each relevant coin worth the same. Mutual trust and our faculty of memory enable us to hold the meaning of certain words constant in localized situations. But such as these are not the only units of empirical significance. It's also characteristic of a shared world that its temporal extension means that it can be structured in terms of concepts and modes of presentation that can cover change and can themselves change. And that includes the stories we write about others or tell ourselves. I imagine I'm engaging when I empathize with a being that's alive. That's what I imagine, they're dead. That has memories, beliefs, hopes, expectations. And those memories may be poor, their beliefs well or badly grounded, contradictory, maybe their situation's hopeless. Others have plans and may have confidence to succeed, seeing themselves as engaged in ongoing actions, states of affairs in which they play a part. They may perceive their world as fixed or as changeable. I imagine that they've inherited, have learnt, or they've developed a complex range of attitudes. I imagine that they are rational much of the time, but I'm very careful what sense to give to that and don't need to commit myself to a particular position here. And any one of these characteristics, any of them might be consciously or unconsciously held. I imagine that I share a human nature with them, but I'm very wary of all the philosophical models that have been offered for that. Plato's Socrates thought that some of us motivated by reason, some by spirit, some by desire. That's now changed over the centuries into the idea, widely used, that humans are motivated by desires and means end beliefs. Some people think that desire maximization is essential. They've been modeled sometimes as causes of action, so we can allow covering law theory to get a grip. And Kant, of course, gave morality a central place in understanding human nature. William Drey rightly brought to our attention the calculations under constraints of appropriateness that individuals might make. Yet all these philosophical models seem to me flatly false if they make any claim to being exhaustive as characterizations of that human nature which we empathize with in the general case. Where they are true, they are contingently so, applying to some and not others. Supposedly universal models of human nature such as these miss out on the most obvious feature of the general case of empathy, which is that we are attempting to put ourselves in the position of another and looking around their world for ourselves, spying out the spatial and social surroundings and looking forwards and backwards in time, as far back and as far forward as we can, reconstructing as best we can relevant memories, imagining their future as they imagined it. Insofar as such looking requires conceptualization, rather than what we, as empiricists, might once have called raw experience, we have to conceptualize that world in which we find ourselves when empathizing with somebody else. But it's an abstract, Descartes-led possibility that our conception of another's world might be radically different from theirs. We should hesitate before thinking that to be a practical problem. It's structurally similar to that problem on which first-year philosophy students cut their teeth. Whether you really see as green what I really see as red, but where our use of those words has been such that we always agree on what colour something is. Rather, the evidence by which we're able to empathize with another person, either past or present, drives the conceptualization to be used in making sense of their world. There may not be any choices to be made here, either for us or for those we empathize with. It's a factual question determinable by evidence whether or how far any difference in fundamental modes of conceptualization exists between us and those we empathize with. It remains the case that they knew things we don't, and we know things they didn't. It's contingent what those things are. There's a sense in which we share consciousness with those with whom we successfully empathize, just insofar as we share with them the meaning they make of their world. It might be thought that merely sharing language with them would ensure this. But there are various ways in which the meaning we make of their worlds will not necessarily be the meaning they make. We have hindsight. We can use what Dante called narrative sentences to re-describe their worlds in ways they might not have available to them. Even in our present world, we may be rivals with other people alive now as to how to give meaning to the world in which we live. Sharing with that world with them will have its contingent limitations. We may also, of course, agree with them. We may agree with those already dead as to what that meaning is. We may, for example, share a vision that they once articulated, and we may be carrying on with its implementation. We can give meaning to our world by making it through our actions. On the other hand, in the case of individuals sufficiently distant from us in the past, or with respect to our heritage, we will not have been for them a part of their imagined future, not a part of the world they were or were trying to make. Their ability or inability to grasp and control their future is essential to our understanding of them, the more so the more they differ from us. So the world sorted in that holistic temporal way I've described includes the past, present, and pragmatically foreseeable future in which a person actually lives. Despite Morton White's confidence, he was not able to make his future academic philosophical world beyond the very immediate. Framing the future of philosophy, in particular the philosophy of history, in terms of the atomistic empiricist assumptions he brought to it, was a failure. As a matter of historical fact, the future of philosophy of history in our intellectual inheritance was made by Hayden White, not Morton White. Similarly, it was Kuhn, not Hempel, who framed the then future of philosophy of science. I heard Hempel admit defeat in Cambridge in 1971. It's a contingency whether and how far anyone gets to make or control their future, but in general I share the view of Vico that we make the world in which we live. And we can see this using this familiar example from Dante. The 30 Years' War began in 1618. Nobody in 1618 could have known that the 30 Years' War was beginning because they would have had to wait 30 years to find out. That is not a point of principle, as if it was impossible to know things 30 years ahead. It depends on how much power somebody had in 1618. Imagine some Roman emperor in charge. With overwhelming power for hundreds of years on the European stage, the imperial machine the emperor controlled might well have continued, even after the emperor's death, to wage a planned war for 30 years and then call it off. But we don't need speculative examples. Historians are very aware of facts such as these. How politicians in power can meet the future world is exemplified by historian Maurice Cowling describing high politics in his 1971 book, The Impact of Labour, 1920 to 24, The Beginnings of Modern British Politics. And I quote bits from that. The first context in which high politics was played was the context in which politicians reacted to one another. The political system consisted of 50 or 60 politicians in conscious tension with one another, whose accepted authority constituted political leadership. In this context, significance arose from mutual recognition, not from office, but from a distinction between politicians inside Parliament and outside, whose actions were thought reciprocally important, and those whose actions were not. It was from these politicians that almost all initiative came. The language they used, the images they formed, the myths they left had a profound effect on the objectives other politicians assumed could be achieved through the political system. High politics was primarily a matter of rhetoric and maneuver. Political rhetoric was an attempt to provide new landmarks for the electorate. Political maneuver was designed to ensure that the right people provided them. Rhetoric was an attempt at constructive teaching, an effort to persuade the new electorate to enter the thought world inhabited by existing politicians. Party politics issued in a rhetorical persuasion to adopt the language and expectations of the politician who used it, a successful of affirmations designed to sound resonantly in the ears of whatever audience was being addressed. The central political achievement was not representation, but rhetoric. It was that rhetoric, once successfully taken up and acted upon by the relevant audience adopting the thought world in question, that made the future world. Verum factum, as Vico said. Generalizing from this, and with an eye on theorizing the reality of history, it's not representation but rhetoric which makes our world. This is not the world that science describes, but the actual world in which we live, a world that, in contingent fact, does support the scientific endeavor, at least for a while, with its frequent denigration of so-called experts. Philosophically foundational here is empathizing with others, with seeing things from their points of view, which is now to be understood in terms of sharing with them, by imagination, a thought world that is temporally extended. It's contingent what that temporal extension is, or where power may lie in controlling it, if anywhere. Making that world meaningful cannot be done with theories of meaning that, like Frege's and drawing on atomistic empiricism, allow as conceptions of time only the point present, or the quasi-mathematically eternal. Similarly, the time-extended advantage that narratives and similar structures have in giving meaning to our world only on occasion, in favorable circumstances, permits a reduction to either causal analysis or rational analysis, as those were understood in the heyday of analytical philosophy of history. If we are to have a heyday for analytical philosophy of history again, then we will need to find something in the work of historians, something that analytical philosophers will find new and valuable with respect to their mainstream interests. Depending on the approach used, that may or may not be something that will permit historians themselves to engage with a degree of authority in such theoretical debates. However, such engagement is not necessary. What I've described in this minor contribution to the philosophy of history need not be seen as a philosophy of history at all. It suggests, among other things, that analytical philosophers attend closely to the notion of temporally extended imagination as being foundational to the construction of that shared reality of which we are conscious. The empathy required for that enables understanding of the world in which we live now. In principle, this need not be a philosophy of historiography at all. It is a philosophy of temporal understanding. Nevertheless, historians empathize particularly well with the temporally extended individual and shared structures that I've described, and as a matter of contingent fact, analytical philosophers have much to learn from historians in this regard. Analytical philosophers need to recognize and value such historical understanding, and if they do, it may well yield another heyday for the analytical philosophy of history. We here can decide now to do this. Thereby we will encompass the future of the analytical philosophy of history. You said to begin with that you worried, as it were, that it was being given a psychological interpretation, and I can't see quite why that would be worrying. What I'm describing here is supposedly a method that we all use. I'm characterizing empathy as being partly analyzed in terms of using the imagination. And we are imagining what it is to be in another person's position. But I'm not actually giving any content to that. Certainly, the bit that matters here, from the example I gave from Maurice Cowling, is the bit that we're imagining is the thought world as used in such an example, and no doubt as understood by Collingwood. Now, imagining such a thought world, I don't see why there's any problem in characterizing that as a psychologically based activity. It is of course the case that if I'm too furious or too drunk even to do such a thing, I mean, that's going to impact on any chance I have of empathizing. And if the person to empathize with is too stupid, drunk, or unconscious, I'm not going to get very far similarly. But in the ordinary course of events, it is an activity one can attempt to engage in. And the crucial point is, on the whole, that's what we do, and moreover have to be able to do all the time. Now, exactly what the psychological details are we picked up, what the limitations are. Familiarly, for example, it's a problem for Collingwood whether or not thoughts would be contrasted with feelings. And there's a fairly obvious way in which I can imagine your toothache, but that doesn't consist in actually feeling the toothache, right? I mean, so you've given me the medicine for it, you need the dentist if that's what you have. I can't really empathize with that in quite the same way I can empathize with your thought. Collingwood thought, it's of course the thoughts that you have I can empathize with in a much fuller sense. Entering the thought world here is fully shared. But that's kind of not surprising. All this is doing is reflecting something we already know, namely that things like pains, with which we find it difficult to empathize, were always a problem as to how you get to understand them. It was one of the things that those who work through Descartes on this, the problem of other minds and so forth, how on earth can we get the word pain to be correctly used by other people, because on the face of it, what they're feeling is something which is so private that none of us could possibly have any access to it. As a matter of fact, of course, there is some pragmatic truth to that. You can't always tell. An unconscious person, you can't ask them if they're feeling any pain, they just don't know. You kind of hope that they're not, and so forth. So there are bits you can't empathise with, but it doesn't matter. You know you're empathising with something which is peculiar or private to the person concerned in some ordinary use of the word private. But when you're empathising with a thought world, which is intended to be shared, then it's not problematic, and we do it all the time. So yes, there's loads to analyse here, but that's the point of what I'm saying. Analytical philosophers need to make better sense of empathy than they have, because for most of my lifetime, all you've got is just that metaphor of putting yourself in another person's shoes and seeing things from their point of view. And hardly anybody's ever said anything more than just that metaphor. So I'm taking one step and saying it's shared imagining here, that's involved, and it's a practical question of what you can share and what you can't.
Yes, thank you. Complete agreement with that. What I find problematic is that the question about empathy seems to not put enough stress on that. When I'm imagining also putting myself in someone else's shoes, then what I'm also trying to imagine is sort of the logical connection between having certain reasons and performing certain actions, and that these things go together. And this is where I've probably taken a pragmatic step too far, possibly from your point of view. I'm very wary of reasons that escape the temporal. The trouble with reasoning is that it tends to take place in an imagined world that has no temporal shape to it at all. There are different ways of running how to express this, but we think of mathematics as paradigmatic of such reasoning. And the idea is that somehow, and this is just another metaphor, but indeed a time-based one, but you have a premise or a set of premises, and a conclusion follows from it, as you might say, instantaneously. The whole thing takes place in an imagined time slice that takes no time at all. Conversely, you can describe exactly the same thing as if every truth in it were eternally so. So the thing is, it has the form almost, it's rather like a Platonic form, or it's always there, it's always available. It kind of escapes the temporal world. And the fact that you can run exactly the same imagined bit of reasoning, either with conception of time, which is a point present, or with a conception of time which makes the whole thing completely eternal, universal in the good old-fashioned a priori sense that mathematics was once supposed to involve. It's precisely that which shows that you're leaving the time-based world in which we actually live. So when you're ascribing reason to other people, you're looking for a supposed logical connection between reasons and action, I think that's a mistake to look for that. I just don't think that reasoning in the practical sense works like that. Now, of course, there's loads to be said about the philosophy of mathematics, no doubt about that. And there are pragmatic answers to these things. Books, all I can say is I've read books about them, but I couldn't possibly summarize them to you because it's not an easy thing to do. But we know that mathematics is different. The rationality of ordinary human beings does not, I think, largely or mainly consist in the kind of rationality you're talking about, and it doesn't require that we have a kind of logical connection between reasons and action, as if an argument, the rational argument was itself the cause of an action, which is what you get in Davidson's Actions, Reasons and Causes, for example.
I'd like to hear you on two questions or two comments. First, in the 60s, following Kuhn and Quine, analytical philosophy of science took a naturalized, historicist turn.
Yes.
In order to regain its glory, shouldn't analytical philosophy of history take the same historical, naturalized turn? We would call them naturalized epistemology of history or historical philosophy of history. Now, having said that, my second comment is, by taking this naturalized turn or historical turn, is philosophy of history dissolving itself in history of historiography, like I think you talked a bit about that?
Yeah.
And is there a virtuous or vicious circularity involved in this? Using history to philosophize about
A quick answer on things like vicious circularities is, of course, that those are not time-based. In other words, they have the same status as the reasoning I was just complaining about in answer to the last person. But I mean, I'll come back to that. If I understand your question right, I think analytical philosophy has already taken a pragmatic turn. Okay, so the advance doesn't come, as it were, from taking that turn. That's already happened. The advance comes from recognizing on the part of those analytical philosophers who've taken a pragmatic turn, a good many of whom have, recognizing that there are things of analytical interest requiring them to analyze in a pragmatic way, as appropriate, the nature of empathy, which is a central part of structuring the shared world that we share with each other. So in other words, the advance comes in recognizing the importance of turning to historical understanding for analytical philosophers to find in historical understanding examples of empathizing with temporally stretched thought worlds, shall we say, as an essential move to make, necessary move to make in the further development of the pragmatically understood analytical philosophy that they're using. Now, you want to say, is there anything vicious about that? Being pragmatic, of course, we can change our minds about all these things. It's a practical question, because even if a heyday were to result from what I've just described, another 10 years, you think, yeah, that's boring, and we'll move on. Okay, but you don't say, well, what I said in 2017, it's all gone by 2027. Have I contradicted myself? No, I've just changed my mind. But pragmatism allows for that, but more to the point, history allows for it. That's the thing, isn't it? I mean, we do live in a changing world. We try to establish truths as best we can, and we do establish them. But the so-called denial of the analytic distinction that Quine offered says that there's always room here for modification with things that we thought once were completely unrevisable. And the general pragmatic principle is that, at least at a meta level, it's all revisable. But in practical terms, as in the case of Morton White, things that we think of as established, the kind of thing that Collingwood described as an absolute presupposition, for example, is never considered to be revisable. It's never even brought to conscious mind as needing to be thought of as something that might be true or false, because it just is taken for granted, unreflectively. But nevertheless, over historical time, these things can and often have been changed. So there's nothing vicious about any of that. If we look at, it's not like we're trying to solve the problem of historical knowledge in some kind of Cartesian sense. Like we are skeptical about historical knowledge, so we're searching for something that will, as it were, overcome the supposed skeptic, who thinks that historians can't provide knowledge. I mean, that question is a Cartesian-based question, which people like Hume, frankly, have actually no business in trying to answer. If you start with Descartes, you get these problems, but don't start with Descartes. Start where we are in the world in which we actually live.
I think that's sort of a question on similar lines. Do you think that there is a difference in kind between history and philosophy of history? So clearly the advice that philosophers should pay more attention to the first order level is good. But it's different to say that, and I'm not sure whether you are going that far as saying that there is no distinction in kind, because some, I suppose in the heydays of the philosophy of history, although people may not have put it in that way, what we're doing was we're teasing out certain structures which are constitutive of certain explanatory practices. Now, these are not a priori in some kind of strictly universal Kantian sense, but they are not purely historicists in the sense that they are constitutive of the practice that they do. So, in a sense, they were committed to a view that there is still a distinction in kind between the level, the science and philosophy, science, history, and history. I just wonder where you stand on that, because I mean, being quite denied that.
Well, yes. You're referring to a distinction in kind between between philosophy and history. The short answer is no, there is no distinction in kind if one takes that to mean a distinction of principle, because that's just another division of a supposedly exhaustive sort, which one denies. If we do follow Quine, you get this claimed continuity between science and philosophy, for example. What was once thought to be different in kind, science on the one hand, philosophy on the other, following Quine is no longer distinct in an absolute sense. And when you've got the analytics and the distinction, the a priori, a posteriori distinction coming from Kant, to accept these as absolute and exhaustive, that's what yields the kind of position you're in. So the philosophers deal with the a priori and the scientists deal with the a posteriori, and that's kind of how you make these separations. Once you've denied that with Quine, you get this continuity between science and philosophy in his argument. I asked him once, I take the point, I said to him that, they're continuous, but why is the science that you think philosophy is continuous with, why is it psychology and not social science? I didn't say to him, and why isn't it history? But I didn't quite dare say that. All I can tell you is he didn't give me an answer, but he didn't say anything about ethics either, anywhere. I mean, it was simply something he couldn't handle. That claim, nevertheless, the argument applies all the way across. They're all continuous. But there is a difference between philosophy and history of a kind, if you like, depending what you mean by kind here. It's perfectly true that historians use different methods from those of philosophers. But that doesn't mean they can't shade one into another. And philosophers examine reasoning. There are meta moves, aren't there, in philosophy, which you might think of as characteristic. For example, you think of the philosophy of science, then you think of the philosophy of science, and then the philosophy of philosophy, and so you can make these meta moves in philosophy. You might think that's kind of characteristic of philosophy, and it kind of is. However, historians do it too. And one of the major moves that one finds in historical reasosoning is something like this. For any assertion you could think of, I'm reusing a kind of idea I used earlier, the historian can always put it in inverted commas. They can always say, back off slightly, make a meta move, and instead of having some assertion, which, if you'll allow me as an analytical philosopher to call it P, as we usually do, the historian can say, he believed, quotes, P. Now that's a meta move, and it's standard for historians to make. And we philosophers can do the same thing. We can flip up and down the meta levels. And of course, as a pragmatic answer to how those levels are sorted and where we are in it at any particular moment, I'm frank that those that I disagree with them thinking that you go up and you hit the a priori, because I don't think that's right. But the fact is that the notion of a kind here is a practical one. And there are different methods and so forth that characterize a discipline of history. And some of us have been trained in both.
Very briefly, three other questions on this. Maybe we should.
Well, thank you for such an interesting talk. I especially appreciated the reference to Lysander's code system, because these are anamorphosis. I have 2 points of inquiry. First, do you think that Collingwood was himself dissatisfied with his intellectualized approach to empathy? as evidenced by his work on magic and superstition and sympathy, which was collected later on. And two, I'm quite interested in the question of what interest Peirce had in history. I've followed it for a while. I've got a few traces, one in Dewey's Theory of Inquiry and others in some obscure works by some Peirceans. But is there anything more you can say about Peirce's interest in thinking reflectively or philosophically about history and where one would read about it?
Okay, well, I'm far too ignorant, but there is an issue of the European Journal of Pragmatism and American Philosophy, which dealt with the question of the interest of pragmatists in history, going back to Peirce, which came out last year. But I can't be more helpful than that, because I'm not an historian of Peirce. But I mean, I'm satisfied to show my own limited reading of that position that is so. That's all I can say. So that might help for a source. I'm thoroughly ignorant about Collingwood beyond a certain point. I dare say he was dissatisfied when you think of the time it took him to get the idea of history, as it were, sorted in any particular way, and it didn't come out long after his death precisely because it wasn't particularly well sorted. So I don't doubt for a moment that Collingwood was, as all philosophers are, I think, dissatisfied with their own productions. So I mean, it's a kind of easy answer, but I'm not able to point you to particular works which would display any merit on my part of being an historian of philosophy, because I'm not much of one.
I suppose the question behind that is my suspicion that he couldn't have been satisfied with it, or he wouldn't have been.
It was that bad, it couldn't be. No, well, I think that may well be so. Well, I think that's one of the points, isn't it, really? The idea of empathizing as he described it, I mean, it needs to be developed. I mean, Dre did a pretty good job of providing a bit of explanation here. I think my general point is there's a lot more work to do. Crucially, it's worth doing. That's the thing.
Thank you. I was wondering that when you say that it's not about philosophy of history, but about philosophy of temporal understanding,
yes.
And we could find something in the works of historians, that historians are good at this temporal empathy or whatever it's called. But I'm wondering that maybe, of course, you said that it's a matter of degree how much authority we should give to the historians in these debates. But in the field of history of science, if one could say that there is and will always be a conflict between philosophers of science and the historians of science about the relevance of temporal understanding in the first place. So someone could perhaps argue that we need to first understand how scientific practices work and whether there is a place for any kind of temporal considerations. And in this sense, there wouldn't be much of a role for philosophers of history in the terms you described their possible project as explicating this temporal understanding. So if I am a philosopher, sorry for the metaphors, if I am a philosopher of history of science, then there perhaps wouldn't be anything for me to do if I try to somehow understand how temporal understanding works in
Okay.
my field.
It's a nice pragmatic answer here. Of course, if what I've described has no application in the history of science, that doesn't in any sense invalidate what I've just said. It just pragmatically means that it doesn't need to be applied in that area. It's really not that simple, is it? The point is, of course, that ever since Kuhn, There's been a very difficult interplay between what's going on in the history of science and how it relates to the philosophy of science. I've known periods when, on various intellectual grounds, departments of history and philosophy of science are split up, one into the history of it, the other into the philosophy of it, because the conceptions that the practitioners had of what they were doing were so much at odds with each other. There have been other occasions when these things have been amalgamated, and I've seen that happen too, precisely because how could they be separated, depending upon the kind of grounds, typically pragmatic, that would suggest that in fact they're continuous with each other in some important way, and that kind of thing continues. And we don't actually need to move away to the history of science. Think of the history of philosophy itself. There are many ways to write the history of philosophy. So many. I'll summarize in any way. I mean, it's just not possible. It all depends, of course, on what kind of conception of philosophy you have. I mean, if you are pragmatic, you've got a certain answers here. But of course, in practical terms, an awful lot of philosophers are not pragmatic. And historians of philosophy often aren't. But insofar as what I've recommended here is the importance of making analytical sense, or better analytical sense of empathizing in order to empathize with a temporally extended matter. Well, so what do you have to imagine, as it were? How relevant would that be to the history of philosophy? Well, if you think of philosophy as involved in something political, like Marxism or something, for example, you might have a very different answer from if it was a conception of something much more mathematical or logical. So do you need to use this temporal conception or empathize with such a thing if you're looking or reading or trying to understand some past philosopher? It depends on the philosopher. Do you have to imagine something temporally extended if it was, for example, the history of mathematics? The short answer is yes, you might have to. You might have to. I mean, it takes time even to follow an argument. This idea, I mentioned earlier, this the kind of example, this supposition that in a series of reasoning it's all kind of instantaneous. That's nonsense. Ask a mathematician, is there anything instantaneous about it? Of course there isn't. It takes time to produce mathematical results. However, put on a computer, even the computer takes time, even if it's only nanoseconds. So you may have indeed to imagine the temporally extended structure of reasoning if you're writing the history of mathematics to try to grasp what the person was doing, how on earth they got that result. I don't think that, in fact, it's quite so easy to escape the need to empathize with a time-extended thought world, even if you're doing the history of science or mathematics or philosophy.
Yeah, thank you. I found this a great talk. Thank you. I also have some practicist inclinations, leanings, but I'm not sure if it's the same sense or same way as you, but I would like to have your view on normativity and the idea of where does it come from, what's the cause of normativity, where does it stem from. Given that you are a pragmatist, and I think you say there are no principal distinctions between Fregean, and so on. And no universal distinctions, but suppose we identify that somehow that this practice is rational, and by definition some other practice is not rational, irrational, non-rational. And you alluded, or you said something like there is no practical room for revising them. So I'm interested in this means there's no practical room for revising them. So if we have identified a rational practice and now we try to abstract something about it, like make theory about it, or try to find the principles guiding this very practice. So we end up having a theory of rational practice or rationality or something like that. Would it have any normative force, or would it mean in that situation that there is no practical room for revising it? Or can it, because it's just contingent?
Well, it seems to me what you're describing is something that presupposes what Wittgenstein would have called a form of life, in which there are established ways of doing things, which are then in some way summarized into some theory which displays their rationality. We do in fact have that. we have established all manner of things, and we don't question the presuppositions upon which they're based, and we may make a judgment as to the nature of rationality in the light of such things, and those we may also make a judgment that people ought to be rational and they so ought to follow such and such requirements of the principles that we have. If you're admitted, for example, in the discipline of history, you're required to behave in certain ways. You're required to do certain things. You're not allowed to get your PhD unless you've done this, that, and the other in history, because there are established ways of doing it, and everybody kind of knows what they are. There isn't any practical or problem for the pragmatics of it in coming to that conclusion. We have a successful world which includes normative values, but there's nothing. You have to remember, what we're not getting here at a better level is a fact-value distinction. I mean, you can leave it open how practical such a distinction is. Just as when Quine denied the analytic and synthetic distinction, he didn't deny it completely, but said, no, there's a pragmatic interpretation of it. Now we can treat things as analytic, now we can treat them as synthetic. Similarly with fact and value. Sometimes we can treat things as factual, sometimes we treat them as normative, and we have that kind of a choice. There are established practices that enable us to do that, and there are also established practices to enable us to change how we do this, depending on what is going on. And you'll find in the operation of the law an awful lot of assertions that kind of have some built-in, both descriptive and evaluative notions.
Well, there are those, but what I'm still getting at is if someone takes seriously this, if I can call this practical meta-philosophy, and thinks that there is all normative prescriptions are contingent, and I'm trying to prescribe this is a good way to write history, for example.
You're trying to,
why should I?
Well, you don't have to, do you? If there's room for, if there are alternatives, the practical question is how you deal with alternatives. I mean, it's often a political question as to how you deal with alternatives. One of the reasons for thinking that things are established is precisely because there are no alternatives that people actually worry about. But of course, alternatives can come to light. And it's often the case. Think of an election, for example, between two political parties. Choices have to be made between the kind of options for the future that each will offer.
But isn't the worry that the technical solves into politics or the distinctions?
I don't think it's a worry, because you see, suppose you actually make the choice. It's not a worry like it's merely a kind of, what should we say, some whim of the electorate. It might be a whim of the electorate, but when you've made the choice, the reality that you've chosen, in ordinary situations anyway, comes about. So it's kind of made true in a way. The world, of course, continues. So there isn't any point at which you can say, well, let's just take a time slice here and see how things work out. It's always a question of, as when choices arise, how are we going to resolve the difficulties in question? I call them political, on the assumption, of course, that we don't have established ways of saying, no, that's one to go for no matter what. We do establish these things. A choice that an examiner might face with a PhD, for example. Do I say, yes, pass, or no, fail? And that's the choice you've got. Okay, that's a choice, all right. But you've got criteria for doing that. And there may be slightly grey areas. That's not the point. In a good many of these cases, you know very well which side it is. And there's no difficulty about it. So you have a choice, but you've got criteria that tell you what you ought to do in those circumstances, and those criteria are established, and on the whole, there's no reason to change them. There can be reason to change them. I set exam orders right here. Instructions for the invigilators, what ought to happen. And I do, that might go to some faculty board or other and have them revised. But, they'll do for this academic year. So you're predicting the future as far as that goes. So that's what I mean by a practical question. And it might be political in the sense that, you try to get some change discussed by the relevant board, and you need people on your side to do it, and you may not succeed. These things happen. It can be nastily political in that way. Academic politics are famously like that. But characteristically, That's not what happens in the case of what I've just described. It's kind of ordinary.
Thank you very much. The normative practice we're subjected to now is coffee, so we've got that to look forward to. But first of all, please thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for sharing that. Thank you all. Thank you.